And I'm Professor of Theology and Director of the Middle East Studies program here at Fordham. It is truly a pleasure to welcome you all to the Fordham Theology 1000 First Year Experience Plenary Address. Now, before I introduce to you our esteemed speaker, let me take a moment to thank those who have offered financial and logistical support to our event, including Chief Diversity Officer Rafael Zapata, the Forum for Theological Exploration, and numerous alumni and friends of the department. Now, before we get started, please be aware that we'll be passing out note cards on which you can write your questions. After you've written your questions, hold up your cards or pass them down the aisle, and one of the ushers will come and pick them up. Some of your questions will be read to the speaker so that he can address them at the end of the lecture. This year, we are so very honored to have with us Dr. Omid Safi, Professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke University. Dr. Safi specializes in the study of Islamic mysticism and contemporary Islam. He's the author and editor of many books, including Progressive Muslims on Justice, Gender, and Pluralism, The Politics of Knowledge and Pre-Modern Islam, Memories of Muhammad, Why the Prophet Muhammad Matters, and Cambridge Companion to American Islam. His most recent work, Radical Love, Teachings from the Islamic Mystical Tradition, published by Yale University Press in 2018, brings to light a lifelong career of scholarship and activism devoted to the intersections of Sufi mysticism and social justice. With its over 200 poems translated from their original Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Urdu, Radical Love projects a simple but revolutionary message. To love God is to love what God loves. As a Muslim scholar and scholar of Islam in a post-9/11 world, and a public intellectual who is often called upon to speak for Islam in popular media outlets such as NPR, PBS, the New York Times, and elsewhere, Dr. Safi has looked to put that message of radical love to action in ways that can only be described as prophetic. As he himself wrote in a 2016 Washington Post op-ed, in which he denounced the bloodbath in Syria and the lack of moral outcry for it, quote, "We are a people praised to speak out for justice, even if our voices shake," unquote. From Charlottesville to Christchurch, from travel bans to the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, from the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham to a parking lot in Chapel Hill, Dr. Safi stands as an outspoken critic of injustice, despite facing both personal and professional threat from inside and outside academia, his country, and his community. And yet, he persists. After all, he suggests, social justice can only emanate from one place, a place of love, not anger. This afternoon, Dr. Safi will share his thoughts on what Dr. King still has to say to America, from Birmingham jail to Riverside to today. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Omid Safi to Fordham University.
Well, you know, most people have to wait till they're dead to have some folks say such nice things about them. And I've got the great luxury every time I get to give a talk of hearing such kind words. So thank you very much for that, and thank you all for being here. If you have come to this talk thinking that you're gonna hear another one of those I have a dream talks, you are in the wrong bleeping talk. Dr. King, whom I love and have devoted my life to the struggle for love and justice that he spent his life dedicated to, weeps in his grave as he sees what has happened to his beloved America. We come from a long line of people who've been taught that if you love the people, you got to tell them the truth. And the truth of the matter is that we, as a people, are in a terrible place. As King himself was fond of singing, wrong is on the throne. Injustice is everywhere. Pain is running amok. As a great Somali British poet once said, she ran her fingers all over the globe and she asked, "Where does it hurt?" And the answer came back, everywhere. Everywhere. You can circle the globe from Syria to Palestine to Kashmir to Iraq to Myanmar to Hong Kong to Lebanon to Ferguson to New York to the south to the west. It hurts everywhere. But Martin, and I like to call him Martin or Brother Martin rather than the more conventional, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Brother Martin was a prophetic figure. And prophetic figures come because their hearts are so moved with a sense of love for the people that they cannot bear to remain silent. They know that unless they say something, the rocks are going to cry out. And the prophets also come with a message of hope. The hour is late. The polar ice caps are melting. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, the army of the dead is at our gates, but there's still hope. There's still time. As long as there is a heart left in this house, as long as there are some of us who are willing to stand up and say, what happens to you affects me. What happens to one affects all. There is still hope for us. What I want to do is I want to invite you all to come on a journey with Martin. I want to take us through some of the key moments of his life, including the letter from Birmingham jail, but also Riverside. Every time that I come to this city and I drive past Riverside Church, that is hallowed ground for me. And so is Memphis. On April 4th of this year, I had one of those incredible honors that you get, if you're blessed, once in a few eternities. I was invited to go and stand on the balcony where Martin was shot and killed, and to give a talk very much like this. What I'm going to share with you today is what I shared on the balcony of Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. I got to stand there with my baby girl, Layla, whom I love with all of my heart. I am in the middle of 3 straight weeks of speaking, to the point that I got to keep taking throat lozenges just to keep talking. And I talk, and I raise my voice, and I organize, and I mobilize, partially so that my baby girl and our baby girls and our as of yet unborn grandchildren can have a life where their dignity is not up for assault. She is 12 years old, and she doesn't yet know that she's standing next to Jesse Jackson and Jim Lawson. She doesn't yet know that in 1960, when Jim Lawson was talking about love as the essential component of nonviolent direct action, he got a warmer reception from the students your age than Dr. King got. but someday she will. And someday she'll know that she got to put the wreath on Martin's balcony. I want to take us back way before the letter from Birmingham jail, which I trust you all have read and will continue to read, to 1955, where if you know something about the December of 1955, you know something about Rosa Parks. You might even know that she wasn't the first person to refuse to give up her seat on that segregated bus. What you may not know is that the city of Montgomery organized a boycott. Boycotts are a proud American tradition. Boycotts go right back to the founding of this convoluted nation built on a hope and a dream on one hand, and the genocide of indigenous people and 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow and its consequences on the other. America is and has always been a dream wrapped around a nightmare wrapped around a dream. If the only Martin that you have ever heard is the "I have a dream" speech, I invite you to Google, not now, I see some of you with your laptops on, not now. Sometime go and watch his interview from the May month of 1967 with NBC News. The first time I saw it, I thought it was some kind of a Hollywood green screen, actor, computer-generated effect, because it doesn't sound like any Martin that any of us have ever seen. That Martin sounds sober, defeated, and he says, "I now recognize that when I spoke about the dream, I might have been a little too optimistic. I recognize now that my dream has in many ways turned into a nightmare." That's not a Martin that we get to encounter, but I think it's important for us to do so. We're going to come back to that Martin, and I want us to also know that this Martin is 26 years old. At the age of 26, he is chosen to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association boycott to end segregated busing in the South. He is not chosen because he's the Nobel Peace Prize winning Martin Luther King. He's not chosen because, as he would be called one short decade after this, he's America's Black Moses. He is chosen because he's the fresh kid out of town. He's chosen because the ministers in town, the old folks, are so entrenched in their power games that they can't decide who should be leading them. So they choose the new kid on the block. That's a reference to 80s, 90s boy bands, for those of you, ask your parents about that. And Martin, who says, "Usually I needed 3 days to write a sermon, I had an hour before making my first public speech." And in 1 hour, he writes essentially what would be the theme of his public ministry. We only have Martin in the public eye for 13 years. And that Martin says that love and justice are linked together. That Martin stands in front of this packed house and says, "We are not wrong. We are not wrong in what we're doing. If we are wrong, then the Supreme Court of the United States of America is wrong. If we are wrong, then the Constitution of the United States of America is wrong. If we are wrong, then God Almighty is wrong." Those are some bold words coming from a Christian minister. The letter that you all have read, the letter from Birmingham jail when Martin is imprisoned without his laptop, without being able to look up stuff on Wikipedia. This is his passionate letter from Birmingham jail. Some of you, if you've already read it, you would have seen his critique of white moderates. And I want you to see what he's responding to. There's a letter that has appeared from the 8 leading white ministers from the city of Birmingham, Alabama, with an appeal for law and order and common sense. What do these 8 white ministers ask for? They ask our Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully. You should press your case in courts and in negotiation and not on the streets. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizens to observe the principles of law and order. The short text of Dr. King's that you all read is a response to these white ministers. Martin is writing as a minister to ministers, as a follower of Jesus writing to followers of Jesus. Martin and his community are called outsider agitators. Those of us who march, those of us who mobilize, those of us who organize, those of us who demonstrate are always called outside agitators. And we keep saying, outside of what? Every time that I am told, go back where you came from, and I tell them, Florida? Why would you do that? Why would you send me back to Florida? They're like, where you really from? I'm like, Florida. No, I mean where you were born, Florida. I mean where you graduated high school, Florida. Where are you really from? I'm like, oh, okay, now I see what you're saying. Because if you look like me, handsome, furry, bald, a little chubby, then I can't really be from here, right? Every time that I go to give some presentation at, doesn't matter where, New York, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and people are like, he speaks such good English. I'm like, bleeper, bleeper, you got to see me curse in other languages, because why is it shocking for you? Outside agitators implies that this is their country. And we are, at best, their well-behaving, tolerated guests. I am not anybody's guest. This is my home. I fight for this home because it is my home. It is my children's home. It is my as of yet unborn grandchildren's home. It is a messed up home, just like my messed up family. But you don't discard your family because it's messed up. You work to make it better. King was called an outside agitator, and he has to document how he's from there, how his people have been there. He then goes on to say, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Way before Martin has started seeing the issues of racism and militarism in global terms, as a child of God and as a minister of the church, he understands that our humanity is bound up together. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Your generation gets that. And you get that in terms of the environment. You understand that if China and India are polluting the earth, then it's going to be Baton Rouge that's going to go underwater. None of us, even if we're sitting in the White House, have the luxury of thinking that our actions bear no consequences for our vulnerable sisters and brothers around the world. Martin states that theologically. He also says something that for me is a special challenge. When he talks about the way to respond to these white moderates in the letter from Birmingham jail, that you got to collect the facts, you got to negotiate, you got to engage in direct action, and then there's that third step that most of us who are activists just try to read very quickly: self-purification. Okay, yes, self-purification, very, very nice. Now let's get on with organizing and mobilizing. Martin says, no, we cannot bring peace to the world if our hearts are filled with rancor. What happens at the outside world and what happens inside of your heart are linked up together. Right? Our Jewish sisters and brothers have known this. Tikkun olam, healing the world, is part of your own process of spiritual purification. And Martin talks about this as well. Martin says lots of other things that I keep reading, and I realize, did people understand how bold and revolutionary these words were? Privileged groups seldom give up their privilege voluntarily. Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. A few years after this, Martin comes and says, the civil rights era was actually relatively easy. We were trying to just give the same rights to everyone, and it meant more economic opportunities. If you got more black folks sitting at the lunch counters, more black folk riding the buses, it means more money for everybody. He says, now we've come to the point where we got to do something about the poverty question. We got to do something about the war question, and that means that the people that have everything have to be willing to give up something, so that the people who have nothing can have something. That's the real test of our democratic experiment. Are the people who have everything willing to give up something? Are we willing to say that when you graduate from Fordham, you should not be saddled with tens of thousands of dollars of student debt? This is not an abstract conversation, my friends. In the nerdiness academic hierarchy, I'm at the top of the ladder. Full professor, endowed chair, whatever the hell that means. I won't tell you how old I am, but it's got a hip problem. A year ago, I finished paying off my undergraduate student loans. Student loans is a social justice issue. Education is a human right. Healthcare is a human right. Are we willing to go where Martin encourages us to go? And it's at that point that he ends up saying the point that we got to keep coming back to. He talks about how he's disappointed with the white moderates. He says he recognizes that the greatest obstacle that black folks face is not the KKK, but it's the white moderates who keep preaching the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Not too fast. Don't rock the boat. We're making progress. You have to understand, these things take time. The white moderates of Martin's age, I want to translate to today's world. And as a Muslim child of Martin, I want to have a come to Jesus moment. Not with the white moderates, but with the white evangelicals. 81% of whom voted for this sexist, misogynist, racist, lying, cheating, deceitful man in the White House. They went into the voting booth proclaiming to dedicate their life to Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior, and they came out of the voting booth having voted for him. Which Jesus do you worship? The Jesus of Wall Street? The Jesus of me, myself, and I? Or the Jesus whose very first public ministry was, I have come to deliver the good news to the poor and to heal the sick and to liberate people? I would encourage our white evangelical sisters and brothers who voted for Trump to come and meet this first century socialist Palestinian Jew whom they could do well to become acquainted with again. His name is Jesus. Martin talks about, in the letter from Birmingham jail, about dramatizing the tensions that exist in society. He talks about, we're not creating tensions, we're showing you the tensions that already exist. And he puts children, 10, 12, 14-year-old children, on the front line of the struggle. This is what turns the civil rights movement around. At this point, we start to get to the Martin that a lot of us recognize. You might even recognize him from the books that you were introduced to in high school. This is Martin, handsome, well-dressed, rising above the crowd. This is the I Have a Dream Martin, except you're never told that this was not the Martin Luther King March. Its official name was the March for Jobs and Freedom. And they were very specific about what they wanted. In today's money, a living wage. That if a person works 40 hours a week, they should not be poor. That was the official demand of the march. And the march was organized by a gay communist and a labor union organizer. So, if your understanding of Martin's movement is that you've got a bunch of black men clergy who are the movement, and at some point we got to open it up and let the women folk in, and let the gay folk in, and let the communist folk in, and let the socialist folk in, that's not how it worked. The folks that you think you're letting in not only were there from the beginning, they were organizing it. The we, the people, has always been a lot more grand and expansive and inclusive than we've usually been told. We don't achieve that myth of racial progress after the march. We don't become post-racial in August of 1963. 2.5 weeks after the march, white terrorists blow up the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing these 4 black girls. 8,000 people in the city show up to mourn them, not a single city official. Martin goes to give the eulogy. In the eulogy, he lays a challenge before us. He says that we got to be concerned not only about the individuals who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, and the philosophy that produced the murderers. My friends, this is not just about Trump. Will it make a difference if you impeach him and get him out of office? Yes. Will it make a difference if you vote and you get somebody else in office? Absolutely. Do not delude yourself in thinking that by changing the individual, you have addressed the philosophy, the worldview, the system, and the structure that has produced this kind of sexism, racism, militarism, homophobia. We got to keep asking ourselves, about half of the country, slightly less than half, voted for him. These are our citizens. We can no more banish them than they can banish us. We got to heal one another. We got to reach out to one another. We got a lot of work to do. Malcolm has one famous meeting with Martin. The two of them are aware of each other. They meet in person this one time. But Martin is always looking over his shoulder, learning, adapting, growing, responding. I don't know if I can play this little clip for you. Probably not.
Don't scare Negroes today with no badge or no white skin or no white sheet or no white anything else. The police the same way. They put their club upside your head and then turn around and accuse you of attacking them. Every case of police brutality against a Negro follows the same pattern. They attack you, bust you all upside your mouth, and then take you to court and charge you with assault. What kind of democracy is that? What kind of freedom is that? What kind of social or political system is it when a black man has no voice in court, has nothing on his side other than what the white man chooses to give him? My brothers and sisters, we have to put a stop to this. And it will never be stopped until we stop it ourselves. They attack the victim. And then the criminal who attacked the victim accuses the victim of attacking him. Yes, this is American justice. Yes, that's right. This is American democracy. Yes, and those of you who are familiar with it know that in America, democracy is hypocrisy. Right. Now, if I'm wrong, put me in jail.
In the mid-60s, Malcolm is growing in his popularity, and a lot of Martin's own followers are starting to listen to Malcolm's rhetoric. So in '63, when those 4 innocent black girls are blown to smithereens in the 16th Street Baptist Church, Martin says, I still have hope that white people will come to their senses. I still have hope that white people can be redeemed and we can gain their friendship. Malcolm says, friendship is all good, but when the white man has his boot on the back of my neck, the first step of friendship is me lifting that boot off of my neck so that I can stand up proud. And Martin adjusts his language. Martin, for the first time, begins to talk about black power. Black is beautiful. Language that he didn't have before. I bring this up partially to tell you that even Martin Luther King was not a finished product. And neither are you. Neither am I. If you're 22 years old and you still haven't figured out what the hell you're going to do in life when you grow up, if you're starting to get real nervous about what you're going to do after college, I want you to remember, Jesus doesn't become Christ till he's 30. Gautama doesn't become the Buddha until he's 35. And Muhammad doesn't become the prophet until he's 40. You're not any cooler than any of them. Be patient with yourself. Life is a journey. Keep your heart open. I want you to see, after Martin wins the Nobel Peace Prize, how he continues to grow, how he continues to expand, and the price that he's willing to pay. He goes from being one of the most admired men in America to someone that has 63% of the American people hating him when he's shot and killed. They don't tell you that when they show you the I Have a Dream speech. That's the question we each got to be asking ourselves. In order to stand up for what's right, in order to affirm the God-given dignity and sanctity of all of us, and all of us means all of us, no exceptions, what are we willing to sacrifice? What are we willing to give up? What do we do with the people who say, yes, yes, the God-given of all of us, except those folks over there? Not the queers, not the socialists, not the Palestinians, not the Mexicans, not the Muslims. Everybody's got an exception clause. What do you do when you say, as we say down south, all y'all means all y'all? No exceptions. Martin is watching people like the most beautiful man that God has ever made. Two greatest boxers in history, Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali, and they're the same person. He is so beautiful, he would beat your brains out and tell you how beautiful he is. I stand by this claim. What you know as hip-hop, Muhammad Ali invented. He scared the bejesus and the be-Muhammad out of white people because they had never seen a black man talk like that to them. Unafraid, unbought, unintimidated. And Ali gave up the heavyweight championship of the world at a time where boxing mattered because he refused to go kill people in an unjust and immoral war. King is watching. King expands beyond his black Southern church to work with Catholics, to march with rabbis. When he makes his most contested political speech of his life, right here in Riverside Church, he is introduced by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who wrote the book on the prophets. And Heschel says, in a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible. It's Heschel who, in the face of the Vietnam War, says, "Is all mercy gone? Have we lost our soul?" And that Martin, the Nobel Peace Prize winning Martin, the March on Washington Martin, the invited to the White House Martin, stands in Riverside Church with his voice shaking, saying, "I have come to this magnificent house of worship because my conscience no longer permits me to remain silent. The time comes when silence is betrayal, and for us, with respect to Vietnam, that time is now." That Martin says, "Men do not easily speak out against their government, but speak we must, guided by the mandate of our conscience and a reading of history." Got to do both. A woke conscience, and you got to read. And it's that Martin who says, "I starting out wanting to save souls, and I'm still in the business of saving souls, but the soul that I want to save now is the soul of America. And I worry that we are a sin-sick country, and if you die and somebody does an autopsy on the soul of America, the answer is going to come back, war. That war killed America." And he says, "I'm a preacher, and preachers name things, and we make lists, and there's a triplet giant of evil that is killing the soul of America." And this is the triplet he names: racism, materialism, and militarism. What does that Martin have to say to our America today? Racism is still with us. The historic bigotry towards people of African descent, indigenous Americans, Jews, Catholics, is now been expanded to include Muslims, Hispanics, and others. Materialism. We are the richest country in the history of the planet. 20% of our babies live in poverty. 40% of our black babies and our brown babies live in poverty. It is obscene. And militarism. What does that Martin have to tell a nation that has spent, I'm a smart man and I cannot even fathom this number, $4,000 billion in a seemingly endless series of wars abroad, where the victims are overwhelmingly black and brown people. $4,000 billion. That's like 4 million million. That Martin tells you, you say you don't have money to take care of your elderly, you say you don't have money to take care of your babies, you say you don't have money to pay for education, you say you don't have money to take care of the environment, you say you don't have money to fix the roads, and yet you have money to be engaging in these endless cycle of wars which don't make us any safer, nor have they brought peace and security abroad. So what's the response to this Martin? What did he give up and risk? The New York Times, that bastion of liberalism, writes an op-ed called Dr. King's Error. The NAACP says, stay in your lane, Martin. We're a civil rights organization. We don't need black folk to be talking about foreign policy issues. The Washington Post says that Martin has diminished his usefulness to his people and to his country. And Life magazine says that he's become a demagogic slander. The FBI calls Martin the most dangerous Negro in America. I want you to be reading the letter from Birmingham jail. I plead with you to read the Riverside Church. What do we do to our prophets? We kill Malcolm, we kill Martin. A year to the day from when Martin delivered that speech, he is shot and killed on the balcony of Lorraine Motel. What's he doing in Memphis, Tennessee? He's there to support sanitation workers, two of whom have been crushed in garbage collecting machines. And the city of Memphis, the white establishment city of Memphis, refuses to give the black garbage collectors a cost of living adjustment. Martin is in Memphis because the gospel commands him to be with the least of God's children. Who's hurting in our world? If you claim to be a person of faith, where do you stand? Where do I stand? Where do we stand with those who find themselves vulnerable? The sanitation workers are still with us. The poor are still with us. And my God, if somebody was writing the Bible today about a sin-sick society, a nation that had lost its moral compass, you know what they would have? They would have someone ripping babies out of their parents' arms and put them in cages. Heschel says the opposite of love is not hatred, it is apathy. We should be on the streets every day, not in our name. If you watch that and you say, this is un-American, that's not good enough. An America which tolerates babies in cages has decided that babies in cages is what America does. If you want it to be un-American, then we have to rise up until it stops. There are no more innocent, vulnerable folks in our midst than children. And for all the 1,000-year of Sufi love that has gone into me, next time I hear somebody say, but their parents chose, I'm going to lose all my love, and I'm going to become all justice and put them in their place. What do we do with those who are hurting, those who are vulnerable? Martin gave of his life for them. I wanted to stand where Martin's blood had spilled to remind myself that there is a sacrifice. You don't need to be a Christian to know that the blood is a sacrifice. I'm not a Christian. The blood is not a theological symbol for me, but it is a symbol of what Martin was willing to give. And everybody and their grandmother is trying to appropriate Martin's legacy. Trump and Pence go to the Martin Memorial for literally 2 minutes. The FBI issues notes commemorating Dr. King, the same FBI that was spying on Dr. King. And the most despicable one is that the NRA issues notes. The NRA, whose weaponry is used to have a mass shooting in the country every day. Everything that was done to Dr. King was legal. COINTELPRO, a government program to spy on our black leaders, Muslim leaders, communist and anti-war activists, and students. We still have such programs. Every Muslim leader in this country, every anti-war activist in this country is under the descendant of COINTELPRO. My tax dollars go to spy on me by the government, of the people, by the people, for the people. That's what the letter from Birmingham jail means when he talks about there comes a time when you have to break an unjust law. Just because something is legal, slavery, doesn't make it right. Remember that J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI for 48 years, writes a letter to King telling him that he's got 3 days to kill himself. Otherwise, he's going to expose King for the possible marital infidelity that he committed. Got a few minutes to wrap up. On April 4th of 2014, I had a chance to sit down with a friend of Dr. King's, the late Vincent Harding. Uncle Vincent, as we call him, actually wrote the draft to the Riverside Church. And Vincent talked about America's relationship with the Middle East and the Muslim people today is a continuation of America's relationship with Vietnam in the 60s. Does anybody know, the week that Martin was shot and killed, the name of the sermon that he was working on? That sermon was called Why America May Go to Hell. Not, I want America to go to hell, but unless we right our way, unless we stop this warfare and this oppression of black folk and the poor folk, this is leading us as a nation to damnation. That's a prophetic figure who stands in the middle of his people, of her people, and say, I love my people too much to remain silent. What do we do with a nation that has now been involved in so many endless military acts all over the world? And what do we do when the weaponry that we're using to kill black and brown people in Africa and the Middle East is being sold back to our inner city police departments so that our inner city police forces are following the handbooks for quote-unquote counterterrorism to deal with primarily black and brown population in our inner cities? This is not your grandfather's police force, but this is Ferguson. And this is Ferguson. But there is hope, And I want to end on the side of hope. When in Ferguson the police are using tear gas, the children of Gaza in Palestine tweet to Black Lives Matter activists in Ferguson saying, they're using tear gas on you. This is the same tear gas that the American companies are selling to the Israeli Defense Force. If you wash your eyes like this with milk, it hurts a little bit less. We thought during the reign of Obama, America's first Muslim president, thank you for laughing at that one. I get nervous when people don't laugh at that. And Obama deliberately promoted this notion that he was the fulfillment of Martin. For his second term, he literally put his hand on Dr. King's Bible, even as he expanded. And I love Barack Hussein Obama, love Michelle a little more. Even as he expanded the programs for domestic surveillance and continued Guantanamo Bay torture and the use of drones. Just because I am fundamentally opposed to the orange Oompa Loompa in charge right now doesn't mean that I had to keep my mouth shut when injustice was being committed for our half-Muslim, black, charismatic president. When you see someone who runs on a campaign of shutting out people based on their race and ethnicity, it's not just about a person. When you hear someone say this grammatically flawed sentence, I think Islam hates us, and every bone in my body that had to learn English at the age of 14 says, Islam cannot be the subject of that sentence, since Islam is a system of belief and practices. Muslims might hate you, and they would be perfectly entitled if they did, but Islam as a religious system doesn't hate, nor does it brush its teeth. As those who are committed to hating everybody under the sun are mobilized and organized, those of us who are committed to liberation and justice and dignity of all have to be equally organized. Let me end with a word about love. Martin's whole public ministry was a work of love. It was a reminder that love is not, as he called it, emotional bosh. Love is not about mushiness. Love is that divine force that brings you into existence. When this love comes into public, we call it justice. The work of justice, the work of building the beloved community for all of us, has to be a work of love. And the more you let this love flow, the more you let this love spill over, the bigger your heart gets, the more expansive your heart gets. You can't love other people if you hate yourself. You want to love the person next to you, but you can't stop there. You want to love your partner, but you can't stop there. You want to love your family, but you can't stop there. You want to love your neighborhood, your community, but you can't stop there. You want to love your nation, but you can't stop there. Love is this divine force that insists on spilling over and over and over until everyone and everything is awash in it. We talked a lot about Martin, talked a little bit about Malcolm. I'm going to end with one little love quote from a 13th century Persian mystic named Rumi. this is my last word for you before we open it up for some Q&A. Rumi at some point says, you and I have to live as if you and I never heard of a you and an I. You and I have to live as if you and I never heard of a you and an I. Let me encourage us to go back and study the prophets of every tradition, prophets of your own tradition. Let's figure out why we keep killing the prophets, and let's try to figure out how do we not venerate the prophets, but stand face to face being challenged by them. The world that you save is the world that we all have to live in together. Either we go up together or we go down together, but we're in it together. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much. We have a few moments for some questions. So I have a couple here. Would Dr. King have any criticisms of contemporary progressive politics in the U.S.?
You know, King himself was never a finished product. You see him continuing to grow and change even as he was a product of his own time. So, for example, there's no doubt that when it comes to questions of gender justice, a lot of the behavior of Dr. King himself would leave a lot to be desired by many of us who consider ourselves feminists. He would have a lot of criticisms of us. Many of us would have criticisms of him. The issues of gay and lesbian rights were not really on his radar, apart from his close personal friendship with Bayard Rustin, whom he protected from criticism from more conservative clergy. I would suspect that the most important critique that Dr. King would have of a lot of contemporary progressive activists would be in the distinction between rage and outrage. I think Martin would always say, if you're not outraged at what's happening, you're not paying attention. And rage can get you up, but rage can't build the beloved community. You need to be outraged, but I suspect that King would push a lot of current progressives to tap deep into that reservoir of love that sometimes it feels like is missing a little bit from some parts of progressive politics.
To what extent do you think that the different messages of King and Malcolm X stem from their different religious commitments?
There's been a long tradition of juxtaposing Martin and Malcolm. Great erudite scholars like James Cone have talked about them as this one is Christian, that one is Muslim, this one is gentle, that one is fierce, right down to that one is tall, this one is short, that one is thin, this one is huggable. There's no question that there are some important differences in the way they go about them. Malcolm is unapologetically a person who talks about liberation starting with your community first. You cannot free the world if your community is enslaved. Martin always appeals to the conscience of all, and in particular, white society, So there is that particular difference. I think the way that Cone, given his own religious sensibilities, overplays their difference is that if you see the trajectory that Martin is on and the trajectory that Malcolm has been on, I think they're converging. And in particular, in the last 3 years of Martin's life, he's talking about the Poor People's Campaign. He's talking about issues of economic exploitation. He's talking about colonialism. All the same issues that Malcolm has been talking about. And Malcolm, after his pilgrimage to Hajj, when he's giving his famous speeches in Detroit and elsewhere, he talks about, in a language that today sounds like gay politics, he says, you got to leave your religion at home in the closet. He says, if we try to argue on the basis of theology, we're never going to agree. So he says, you leave your theology in the closet, work together on the common ground of the political project that is shared among us. So I do think that in the end, there's a little bit of commonality and common trajectory more than it's sometimes been assumed.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more. Someone wants to know what is the meaning of self-purification that Dr. King mentions, if you could elaborate on that a bit. And is this a spiritual process that is different in different religious traditions?
Yeah. For Martin, self-purification was the furthest thing from being abstract and theoretical. Long before, and I had a chance to talk with Jim Lawson about this year when I was in Memphis with him, long before 18 and 20-year-old black students ever were asked to sit down in the lunch counters of Greensboro and Nashville and elsewhere in the South, they would be subjected to extensive training where they would have these simulations where they're sitting down in a chair and people are getting in their ear and they're insulting them. They're calling them every racial insult in the book. They're even having the sound of dogs and things around them. Everything that they're going to see once they move into the battlefield of racial justice. And the key was not quite what we generally think of as turning the other cheek. I think there's a way in which we understand turning the other cheek in this decontextualized, deracialized, depoliticized context. For Martin and his followers, self-purification meant, in confronting evil, I will not retaliate in immoral ways. And you cannot defeat injustice if you're enslaved to your own retaliatory response.
So thanks everyone for coming, and please join me in one more round of applause. Thanks.